In the vast silence of the desert, where the wind carves stories into the sand and time itself feels older than memory, there was once a boy cast out, nearly forgotten, and yet never abandoned. His name was Ishmael, and what began as a story of exile would become the foundation of a civilization that would one day stretch across continents. But how does a child sent away into the wilderness become the ancestor of nations? How does a prophecy whispered in the wilderness echo through history, shaping the world we live in today? To understand this, we must go back to a moment of desperation, faith, and divine promise. The story begins with Abraham, a man revered across religions, chosen by God for a mission that would change humanity forever. In his old age, before the birth of Isaac, Abraham had a son through Hagar, an Egyptian woman. That child was Ishmael, but this was not a simple family story. Tensions grew, and eventually, Hagar and her young son were sent away into the barren desert. Imagine the scene, a mother and her child alone in an endless wilderness, no water, no shelter, no clear path forward. The sun burns overhead, the earth offers nothing. This is where most stories would end, but this is where Ishmael's story truly begins. According to the Quran in Surah Ibrahim, Abraham leaves Hagar and Ishmael in a barren valley, what we now know as Mecca. Hagar runs desperately between the hills of Safar and Marwa, searching for water for her crying child. 7 times she runs, hope fading with each step, and then the miracle water bursts forth from the ground beneath Ishmael's feet, the well of Zamzam, a source that has never dried, flowing for thousands of years. This moment is not just survival. It is the beginning of a legacy. God had heard the cries of the child. In the book of Genesis, Ishmael is described as a wild man, a phrase often misunderstood. It does not mean savage or lost. It means free, untamed, independent, a man whose hand would be against all and all against him, a life of struggle, a life of resilience, but also a life of strength. And in that same passage, God makes a promise. Ishmael will not be forgotten. He will become the father of 12 princes. A great nation will come from him. Think about that. A boy left in the desert destined to father nations. History begins to unfold. As Ishmael grows, the barren valley begins to transform. People are drawn to the water of Zamzam. Trade routes begin to form. Tribes settle. Life emerges where there was once only emptiness. Mecca becomes more than a refuge. It becomes a center, and Ishmael does not remain a passive figure. According to Islamic tradition, he grows into a prophet, working alongside his father Abraham to build the Kaaba, the sacred house dedicated to the worship of one God. Because from this moment, Ishmael's legacy is not just biological, it is spiritual. The Kaaba becomes a symbol of unity, a place where tribes gather, a place where humanity turns toward one creator. And from Ishmael's lineage, centuries later, a man will be born, Muhammad, peace be upon him. But we are not there yet. First, we must understand what it means to be the wild man. Ishmael's descendants spread across the Arabian Peninsula. They become tribes known for their endurance, their strength, and their independence. They live in harsh conditions, but they adapt, they survive, they thrive. Empires rise and fall around them. Persians, Romans, the descendants of Ishmael remain unconquered in spirit. The desert, which once seemed like a curse, becomes their greatest teacher. It shapes them, hardens them, prepares them, and then the moment comes. 6 centuries after Jesus, in the heart of Mecca, among the descendants of Ishmael, a man receives revelation. The Quran begins. This is where Ishmael's legacy reaches a new dimension, because the message brought by Prophet Muhammad is not tribal. It is universal. It calls for justice, for unity, for submission to one God, Islam. And suddenly, the descendants of Ishmael are no longer isolated tribes. They are united. What happens next is one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. Within a few decades, the message spreads across Arabia. Tribes that once fought each other become brothers. A civilization begins to form, rooted in faith, discipline, and knowledge. And then it expands from the deserts of Arabia. This new civilization reaches the borders of the Byzantine and Persian empires. Within a century, it stretches from Spain to India. Cities rise, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, centers of learning emerge. Scholars translate ancient texts, preserve knowledge, and push the boundaries of science, medicine, and philosophy. This is not just expansion, this is transformation. The legacy of Ishmael is no longer confined to a desert. It is global. But here is where the story becomes even more profound, because this legacy is not just about power or territory. It is about identity. The wild man prophecy, this idea of independence, resilience, and struggle remains at the core of this civilization. It is seen in the ability to endure hardship. It is seen in the preservation of faith across centuries. It is seen in the millions who still trace their spiritual lineage back to that moment in the desert. Every year, millions of people travel to Mecca for Hajj. They walk between Safa and Marwa, just as Hagar did. They drink from Zamzam, they circle the Kaaba, they reenact the story, not as a ritual alone, but as a reminder that from desperation can come destiny, from isolation can come unity, from a single child in the desert can come a global civilization. But the story does not end here, because Ishmael's legacy is still unfolding. Today, nearly 2 billion people identify with Islam. They live in every corner of the world, Asia, Africa, Europe, the Americas. Different languages, different cultures, but one shared story. A story that begins with a mother running in the desert. A story that begins with a child crying out in thirst, and a God who hears. There are those who still misunderstand the phrase wild man. They see conflict, division. But if we look deeper, we see something. We see resilience. We see survival against impossible odds. We see a people who were shaped by hardship but not broken by it. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the blessing. Not comfort but strength. Not ease but endurance. Because civilizations are not built in comfort. They are forged in struggle. And Ishmael's story is one of the greatest examples of this truth. From the sands of Mecca to the cities of the modern world, his legacy lives on not just in bloodlines, but in belief, in culture, in identity. It is in the call to prayer that echoes 5 times a day across continents. It is in the pages of the Quran recited by millions. It is in the unity of people who turn toward one direction in worship, no matter where they are. All of it traces back to that moment when a mother refused to give up, when a child was on the brink of death, and when divine mercy changed everything. So the next time you hear the name Ishmael, do not think of a forgotten son. Think of a beginning. Think of a legacy that defied the odds. Think of a prophecy that became reality. Because in the end, the story of Ishmael is not just about the past. It is about how faith, struggle, and divine promise can turn even the most unlikely beginnings into a force that shapes the world. And it all started with a cry in the desert. And yet, even after centuries of expansion, power, and influence, the deeper question still lingers. What truly carried Ishmael's legacy forward? Was it conquest? Was it geography? Or was it something far more enduring, something invisible yet unbreakable? To answer that, we must return once more to the beginning, not just to the desert, but to the nature of the promise itself. In the Quran, God does not merely describe events, he reveals patterns. And the story of Ishmael is not an isolated moment in history. It is part of a divine pattern repeated throughout time. That those who are tested the most are often chosen for the greatest roles. Ishmael was not raised in comfort, he was not surrounded by wealth, nor protected by the structures of a settled society. His environment was harsh, uncertain, and unforgiving. But it was precisely this environment that shaped the character of his descendants, a people of endurance, a people who could carry a message across deserts, across languages, across cultures without losing its essence. And this is where the legacy deepens. Because long before the rise of great Islamic empires, there was something else taking root among the descendants of Ishmael, a memory, a spiritual memory tied to the Kaaba, to the worship of one God, to the footsteps of Abraham. Even when time passed, and even when elements of idolatry crept into Mecca, that original foundation was never completely erased. It remained waiting for the moment when it would be restored. And when that moment came, it did not come quietly. It came with revelation. The Quran did not introduce a new God. It called people back to the God of Abraham, the God of Ishmael. It reminded them of a covenant they had forgotten, a legacy they had drifted away from. This is why the message resonated so deeply, because it was not foreign. It was a return, and this return ignited something powerful. Imagine tribes that had been divided for generations, suddenly united under one belief. Imagine a society where lineage and tribal pride were everything, now being told that the most honored among them are those most conscious of God. This is not just a religious shift, it was a complete transformation of identity. And from this transformation came momentum, a momentum that could not be contained. Within years, the Arabian Peninsula was unified. Within decades, the message reached beyond Arabia. And within a century, it had become one of the most influential civilizations in history. But again, the question remains, what made it last? Because many civilizations rise quickly and fall just as quickly. But Ishmael's legacy endured. The answer lies not just in expansion, but in preservation. The Quran memorized word for word, generation after generation. The rituals of worship performed daily, identically across the world. The story of Hagar relived every year during Hajj. These were not just traditions, they were anchors. Anchors that kept the identity intact, no matter how far it spread. And so, even as the Islamic world expanded into diverse regions, into Persia, into Africa, into Southeast Asia, the core remained unchanged. One God, one book, one direction of prayer. This unity, rooted in the legacy of Ishmael, became one of the defining features of the civilization. But history is never without its challenges. Empires fractured, political struggles emerged, external forces attempted to break this unity. And yet the legacy did not disappear. It adapted, it survived. Even in times of decline, the spiritual connection remained strong, because the true strength of this legacy was never political power. It was belief. And belief does not collapse the way empires do. Today, when we look at the world, we see borders, nations, and divisions. But beneath all of that, there is a thread that connects millions, even billions of people, a thread that leads back to Ishmael. It is seen in the Arabic language preserved in prayer. It is seen in the shared rituals performed by people of every race and background. It is seen in the sense of belonging to something greater than oneself. And perhaps most powerfully, it is seen in the continued relevance of the story. Because the story of Ishmael is not just about history. It is about human struggle. It is about what it means to be tested, to feel abandoned, to stand at the edge of survival, and to still find hope. It is about trusting that even in the most barren moments of life, there is a plan unfolding. A plan that may not be visible in the moment, but becomes undeniable in hindsight. And this is why the story continues to resonate. Because every generation faces its own deserts, its own moments of uncertainty, its own questions about purpose and direction. And in those moments, the legacy of Ishmael offers something powerful, not just answers, but perspective. That beginnings do not define endings. That hardship can be the foundation of greatness. That what seems like isolation can be preparation. From a historical perspective, the rise of Islamic civilization is one of the most studied phenomena in the world. Scholars analyze its speed, its scale, its influence. But beyond the data and the timelines, there is something deeper, something that cannot be measured, a sense that this was not random, that there was a continuity, a thread of purpose that began with a promise and unfolded across centuries, and that promise began in the wilderness. So when we speak of Ishmael's legacy, we are not just speaking of genealogy, we are speaking of transformation, of how a single life shaped by struggle can influence the course of history, of how divine promises, even when they seem distant, unfold in ways beyond human imagination. And perhaps, most importantly, we are reminded that no story is ever truly small, because even a child in the desert can become the beginning of something that changes the world. And as the winds of the desert continue to move across the sands of time, they carry with them echoes of that first cry, a cry that was heard, answered, and transform into a legacy that still lives today. A legacy not of survival alone, but of purpose. A legacy that reminds us even now that what begins in silence can echo through eternity. But even now, there is one final layer to this story that most people never stop to consider. If Ishmael's legacy shaped a civilization, then what does it mean for the world today? Because we are no longer living in the age of tribes or early empires, the world has changed. Nations are interconnected. Cultures overlap. Technology has erased distances that once defined civilizations. And yet the legacy remains, not frozen in the past, but alive, moving, adapting. The descendants of Ishmael are no longer confined to deserts or specific lands. They are everywhere. In the cities of the West, in the villages of Africa, in the heart of Asia, different languages, different faces, but carrying the same spiritual imprint. And here is where the story becomes even more profound, because what began as a physical journey has become a universal identity. In the current, there is a powerful idea repeated again and again that the true measure of a people is not their origin, but their consciousness of God. Not their lineage, but their character. This transforms the entire meaning of legacy. Ishmael's legacy is not limited to those who descend from him by blood. It extends to all who carry the message, all who stand in prayer, all who remember the story. In that sense, the wild man is no longer just a historical description. It becomes symbolic. A symbol of independence from falsehood, a symbol of resilience in the face of pressure, a symbol of standing firm even when the world pushes back. And if we look carefully, we can still see this spirit alive today. In the ability of people to hold on to faith in environments that challenge it, in the courage to maintain identity in a world that constantly demands conformity, in the quiet strength of millions who live ordinary lives, but carry an extraordinary connection to something greater. But every legacy faces a test, and perhaps the greatest test is not survival, but preservation of meaning, because over time it is easy for rituals to remain while their purpose fades. It is easy for history to be remembered but not understood, and this is where the story of Ishmael calls us back, once again, back to the essence, back to that moment in the desert. A mother running between two hills, a child crying in thirst, no power, no status, no civilization, just need and trust, and a response from God. That moment strips everything down to its core. It reminds us that this entire legacy, this vast global civilization, did not begin with strength. It began with dependence on God, and perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, because as powerful as civilizations can become, they can also lose their way. They can become distracted by power, by division, by the noise of the world. And when that happens, the only way forward is to return. Return to the source, return to the simplicity of faith, return to the meaning behind the rituals. This is why, even today, the acts of worship connected to Ishmael's story remain unchanged. The running between Safa and Marwa, the drinking of Zamzam, the circling of the Kaaba. These are not just actions, they are reminders. Reminders that no matter how advanced the world becomes, the foundation remains the same. Faith, trust, submission to one God. And when millions perform these acts together, year after year, century after century, it becomes clear that this is not just tradition. It is continuity, a living connection between the past and the present, between Ishmael and the modern world. And so the story comes full circle, from a child in the desert to a global civilization, from a moment of desperation to a legacy of faith, from a prophecy to a reality that spans the entire world. But perhaps the most powerful part of this story is what it leaves us with, a question not about history, not about the past, but about us. What do we do with this legacy? Do we see it as something distant, something that belongs to another time? Or do we recognize that it is still unfolding, still shaping the world, still calling us back to something deeper? Because in the end, Ishmael's story is not just about what happened. It is about what continues to happen. Every time someone turns to God in a moment of need, every time someone holds on to faith in the face of doubt, every time someone chooses purpose over comfort, the legacy lives on, not in monuments, not in empires, but in hearts. And maybe that was always the plan, that a story which began in isolation would never be limited by place, that a child once thought forgotten would never truly be forgotten, that a single moment of divine mercy would echo through generations and shape the course of humanity. So as the winds move across the desert and the world continues to change, one truth remains steady and unshaken. What begins with God never truly ends, and the legacy of Ishmael is living proof. And still, even after everything we have seen, everything history has revealed, there remains a quiet, almost hidden dimension to Ishmael's story, one that is not written in books, but felt in the rhythm of human lives. Because the greatest legacies are not only measured by how far they spread, but by how deeply they endure. Think about it. From a single moment in the desert, a chain of events was set into motion. Not instantly, not dramatically at first, but slowly, generation after generation, choice after choice, until what once seemed small became unstoppable. This is how divine promises unfold, not always in sudden miracles, but in continuity, in survival, in the quiet persistence of truth across time. And if we listen closely, we can still hear echoes of that first moment, not in the wind of the desert alone, but in the lives of people today. A mother whispering a prayer for her child, a man standing alone in the night turning to God, a community gathering, shoulder to shoulder in unity. These are not separate moments, they are reflections of that original story, because the same God who answered Hagar still answers, the same mercy that brought forth Zamzam still flows, and the same promise that protected Ishmael still extends across time. But here is where the story becomes deeply personal, because it is no longer just about Ishmael. It is about anyone who has ever felt lost, uncertain, or on the edge of giving up. The desert is not just a place, it is a state, a moment in life where everything feels empty, where the path forward is unclear, where hope feels distant. And in those moments, the story returns not as history, but as guidance. Hagar did not sit and wait, she ran. Again and again. Between Safar and Marwa, her effort did not immediately bring water, but it was seen it mattered. And when the answer came, it came from a place she could not have expected. This is the essence of the legacy: effort and trust, struggle and reliance, action and faith. And this balance is what carried Ishmael's descendants through centuries. It is what allowed a civilization to rise, not just on belief, but on discipline, knowledge, and purpose. It is what inspired scholars to seek understanding, travelers to cross oceans, communities to build systems rooted in justice and compassion. Because faith, when truly lived, does not isolate, it transforms. And this transformation is still happening. In a world that often feels chaotic, divided, uncertain, the legacy of Ishmael offers something rare: clarity. A reminder that identity is not defined by circumstances, but by connection to something greater. A reminder that strength is not the absence of struggle, but the ability to endure it with purpose. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that no one is ever truly alone, because the same God who saw a mother and child in the middle of nowhere sees every human being, no matter where they are, no matter how lost they feel, no matter how small their situation may seem. This is why the story continues to resonate, not just across cultures, but across time, because it speaks to something universal, something deeply human: the need for hope, the need for meaning, the need to believe that even in the hardest moments there is a plan. And so, as we reach the end of this journey, we begin to understand something profound. Ishmael's legacy is not just a historical phenomenon. It is a living message, a message that continues to guide, to inspire, to challenge, a message that became a testimony from the wilderness of Mecca to the hearts of billions, from a cry for water to a call that echoes across the world. Allah Akbar, God is greater, greater than fear, greater than hardship, greater than the limits we place on our own stories. And that is the final truth this legacy leaves us with. That what may appear as an ending can be the beginning of something far greater. That what may feel like abandonment can be divine placement. That what may seem like a small, forgotten moment can carry the weight of eternity. Because in the end, the story of Ishmael is not just about how a wild man became the father of nations. It is about how God turns struggle into strength, isolation into identity, and faith into a force that shapes the world, a force that cannot be erased, a force that continues to grow, a force that lives on in every heart that still believes. And it all goes back to that silent desert where a child once cried and the heavens answered. And even now, after everything has been said, there is one final realization that settles quietly, almost like the desert at dusk, calm, vast, and filled with meaning. Because when we step back and look at the entire journey, from that first desperate moment to the rise of a global civilization, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This was never just history. It was design. Every hardship, every delay, every unanswered moment in the beginning, it was all part of something greater unfolding. And what seemed like abandonment was, in reality, positioning. Ishmael was not placed in the desert to be lost. He was placed there to begin. And that changes everything. Because it means the origin of this legacy was never accidental. It was intentional, precise, measured in a way that only becomes clear when we look back across centuries. The valley of Mecca, once barren and empty, becomes the center of spiritual gravity for millions. The footsteps of a mother searching for water become a ritual repeated until the end of time. The cry of a child becomes a symbol of divine response. And the life of Ishmael becomes a bridge connecting Abraham's mission to the final message delivered to humanity. This is not coincidence, this is continuity, and within that continuity lies a message that goes beyond civilizations, beyond cultures, beyond even time itself. That God does not choose the obvious beginnings, He chooses the unlikely, because it is through the unlikely that His power is most clearly seen. A desert instead of a city, a child instead of an army, a moment of weakness instead of strength. And from that, something emerges that no human plan could ever replicate. This is why Ishmael's legacy feels different. It does not follow the patterns of typical history. It does not rely on the usual foundations of power. It begins with faith and builds everything else on top of it. And maybe that is why it still stands. Because anything built on power alone will eventually fall. But what is built on faith carries something deeper, something that survives beyond structures, beyond borders, beyond time. And as the world continues to change faster than ever before, this legacy remains steady. Not because the world is stable, but because its foundation is. And this brings us to the final reflection. Because after everything, after the rise of nations, the spread of civilizations, the passing of centuries, the story returns to something simple: a relationship between Dirzo and his creator, between the Dirzo and his purpose, between Dirzo and the truth he is meant to carry. Ishmael's story reminds us that this relationship is not built in moments of ease. It is built in moments of test, in moments where there is no clear answer, where the future is uncertain, where the only thing left is trust. And when that trust is placed in God, something extraordinary begins to happen. Paths open, Doors appear, outcomes unfold that could never have been predicted. Just like water emerging from beneath the feet of a child in the desert. Unexpected, unimaginable, but real. And so the legacy can history books not just in rituals, but in the unseen decisions people make every single day. To trust, to endure, to believe, because in the end, that is what this entire story comes down to. Not just who Ishmael was, but what his story proves. That no matter how impossible a situation may seem, it is never beyond the reach of God. That no matter how isolated a beginning may feel, it can still lead to something that changes the world. And that no matter how long it takes, divine promises never fail. So the next time the wind moves across the desert, and the silence feels endless, remember this. That silence once carried a cry. That cry was heard, and that answer is still unfolding, even now, even here, in ways we may not yet fully understand, but in ways that continue to shape the world, just as they always have. Because the legacy of Ishmael was never meant to end, it was meant to continue through time, through people, through faith, until the very end. And perhaps the most striking part of this entire journey is not what we have already seen, but what still lies ahead. Because a legacy like this does not simply exist to be remembered, it exists to be carried forward. Across centuries, the story of Ishmael has moved from generation to generation, not as a distant tale, but as a living trust. Each generation inherits it, not just in words, but in responsibility to understand, a responsibility to preserve, a responsibility to live it. And this is where the story shifts from history to accountability, because it is easy to admire a legacy. It is much harder to embody it. The descendants of Ishmael by blood or by belief are not just connected to a past. They are connected to a mission that began with Abraham, continued through Ishmael, and reached its final form through the message of Islam, a mission of Tawheed, the oneness of God. Simple in its essence, but powerful in its implications. Because to truly believe in one God is to free oneself from everything else, fear, ego, false authority, and the illusions of this world. And this is what made that early transformation so powerful. It was not just about uniting tribes, it was about liberating hearts, turning people who once bowed to idols into people who stood firm before kings, turning a scattered society into a unified ummah. And this transformation is not locked in the past. It is still possible, still relevant, still waiting to be realized in every heart that reconnects with that original message. But every legacy faces a danger not from outside, but from within, the danger of forgetting its purpose, of reducing something profound into something routine, of keeping the form but losing the spirit. And this is where the story of Ishmael becomes a mirror that reflects not just what was but what is. Are we living the legacy or just remembering it? Are we carrying the message or just repeating it? Are we connected to the source or just to the symbols? Because the power of this story was never in its outward appearance. It was in its depth and its sincerity, in its unwavering connection to God. Hagar did not run between Safa and Marwa because it was a ritual. It became a ritual because of her sincerity, because of her desperation, because of her absolute trust. And that is what gave the act its eternal meaning. Without that sincerity, the movement is empty. Without that connection, the legacy becomes distant. So the question is no longer about Ishmael. It is about us, about whether we can reconnect with the essence of what began in that desert. Because the world today is filled with noise, distractions, pressures, endless demands pulling people in every direction. And in that noise, it is easy to lose clarity, to lose purpose, to forget the simplicity of what truly matters. But the legacy of Ishmael cuts through that noise. It brings everything back to one point, one direction, one truth. That there is only one God and everything else follows from that. And when that truth is firmly rooted, everything changes. Priorities shift, fears lose their hold, purpose becomes clear, and suddenly the chaos of the world no longer controls the heart. This is the real power of the legacy. Not just in shaping civilizations, but in shaping individuals. Because every great civilization is built from individuals who carry something strong within them, faith, discipline, conviction. And when enough individuals carry that, it becomes unstoppable. This is how the legacy began, and this is how it continues. Not through force, not through numbers, but through hearts that remain connected. And as we move forward into an uncertain future, this connection becomes more important than ever. Because the challenges may change, but the solution remains the same: to return, to reconnect, to realign with the purpose that was set from the very beginning, the purpose that began with Abraham, that was lived through Ishmael, that was completed through the final message. And that now rests with those who choose to carry it. So as this story reaches its final moments, it does not close, it opens. It opens a door to reflection, to action, to transformation. Because the legacy of Ishmael is not something you simply listen to. It is something you step into, something you live, something you continue. And maybe that is the greatest sign of all, that a story which began with a single child in the desert did not end with him. It expanded, it grew, it reached across the world, and then it returned to each individual heart asking the same question it always has. Will you carry it forward? Because in the end, legacies are not preserved by time, they are preserved by people. And the legacy of Ishmael now rests in the hands of those who remember, who believe, and who are willing to live what began in that silent desert so long ago. A desert that was never empty, a story that was never small, and a legacy that was always meant to last.